everyone. Welcome to Everything the CBC Says About Weather is a Lie.
What I'm going to speak on is the role of consensus in political movements that claim a scientific basis. I'll tell you right off the bat, the biggest problem in this, from the point of view of public debate, is no one wants to do their homework. We'll get back to that in a moment. This is not a unique issue. There have been quite a few issues, some very serious, where science was used to crush opposition and the science was baseless, but a consensus was claimed. In the US, one issue that I've studied a bit was the exploitation of eugenics. The engineering aspect was you could control the intelligence of your community by selective breeding and by avoiding inferior people, which everyone agreed with, the good and the powerful, in the 1920s. It's interesting that eugenics actually is one of those things for which you have a mathematical proof that it can't work. It's known as the Hardy-Weinberg theorem. I won't go through that at this point. It didn't matter. It satisfied the needs of the politicians, and it went through. A worse example of that, of course, was the leading American exponent of eugenics and immigration policy was a scientist called Laughlin, and he was awarded in the 1930s an honorary degree from Heidelberg. And Hitler, of course, appealed to eugenics for his policies, and again insisted that there was scientific consensus. In some ways, the worst example I know of was Lysenkoism, which was a rejection of the existence of a gene, and which Stalin liked because it said that they could impose changes in their agriculture that would make it more productive just by grafting and doing things like that. And Stalin insisted that all biological scientists in the Soviet Union agree with this. He thus destroyed biology in the Soviet Union, and indeed thousands of scientists objected and were sent to the Gulag, and several were killed. So there are ways to impose nonsense on people, and we've seen this before. The exploitation of climate fits this pattern remarkably well. And one of the things about that is, in such issues, in fact, the science is irrelevant. And that's a kind of dangerous because it's a distraction. It led many of us, including myself, to look at the numerous impossibilities and errors in the theory. The statement that you feel the science has been well developed means you haven't looked at it. That's all it means. Even if you look at the IPCC, it doesn't say those things. Why do you have this? Why do you insist on this? I think it's because, and we see this time and again, consensus is claimed because most educated people know nothing about science. This is something one has to let sink in a little bit. If I ask somebody in the humanities or the social sciences to tell me about the second law of thermodynamics, which is basic in science, I pretty much get a blank look. Maybe it's different in Belgium, but I don't know. When you have a world in which science is important and you don't know about it, you feel uneasy. And yet, as an educated person, you feel entitled to a leadership role in many respects. So this uneasiness is relieved by telling you all scientists agree. When all scientists agree, then you're safe to agree and you don't have to do your homework, as I mentioned. This is kind of a distortion of science itself. Science is a mode of inquiry. It's not a source of authority. The problem or virtue of science, depending on your opinion, is that it's been extremely successful in the modern era. And so it has earned a certain authority in the public mind, and that is something politicians don't have and envy. What I'm going to describe is how this issue arose, as far as I can tell, because it really had its own origins in a certain way in the US. There were meetings, interestingly enough, in the early 80s. The Rockefeller Brothers Foundation has a center in Bellagio. They had a large meeting, largely of science administrators, to get them on board around 81, 82. So there was work to get people on board before rolling it out publicly as an issue. And I would say that the obsession with decarbonization, what we now call net zero, actually had its roots in the post-World War II period, which in the US was an amazing period. It was a period in which ordinary working people could now afford a house and a car and live better than they had. Remember, before World War II, we had the global depression. The response of people who were, quote, educated elite was remarkable. Now, I was a student in the 50s and 60s, and one characteristic of a lot of our courses was to mock the poor taste of the working middle class. Their houses were plain-looking. They didn't have good taste. They were too materialistic, which is a little ironic coming from people who are well off. This sort of simmered and came to a head during the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War in the US was one where essentially the children of the working middle class were drafted and fought, and the students, who at that time were still an elite, the period of massive expansion of education had not yet run its course. They got student deferments. So one had a split in our society, which was not true during World War II. World War II had fairly good representation, but the Vietnam War did not. So how do you justify not wanting to serve your country? Now, one thing is to declare the war was illegitimate. We were on the wrong side, which in retrospect was a little bit absurd. I mean, people were fleeing from north to south. Nobody was fleeing to the north, which was communist. This gave rise to a movement that took the view that the West, and in particular the US, was illegitimate, that it was worthy of being overthrown. Sounds strange at some point. It gave rise to groups like the Weather Underground, the Students for Democratic Society, that were overtly violent. They were committed to the overthrow of the government. They had nowhere near the power to do anything, but they killed a few people, had a few incidents, burnt down a city or two, and generally wrought havoc. I was teaching at the University of Chicago, but we asked a student to take care of our apartment when we were gone from Chicago. We came back at the end of the summer, and there was a police car outside our apartment. The student had turned our apartment into a hostel or a crash pad for the Students for Democratic Society. Our apartment was messy, and there's a lot of the literature of this group there, including plans for poisoning the Chicago water supply. Essentially, we thought that this ended when Richard Nixon was elected president. But we were wrong. By now, it's very well accepted that this was the beginning of Marcuse's march through the institutions, where you began taking over society by avowed revolutionaries intent on destroying Western society. There was a difference, however. This was a new Marxism, and because the enemy was not the capitalists. The enemy was the working middle class. In fact, they realized the capitalists were easy to buy off, and we can see that these days. Right now, there's a lot of emphasis on the march through the educational system. We realized they first took over the schools of education in the US, then humanities and the social sciences, and now, to many of our surprise, science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM. What I think we're forgetting now, and this is perhaps the most serious point, is that these were not the first institutions that were struck. Professional societies were really an easy pickup, and I'll get back to it, but my wife, for instance, during the 60s went to a meeting of the Modern Language Association in America, and that was already fully on board with all these woke ideas. Despite the focus on education, where diversity, equity, and inclusion is a movement that is somehow swept through our educational institutions and corporate America, where you emphasize racial differences and encourage conflict. But that was not the only goal. And I think it would be a big mistake to ignore the fact that revolutionary movements typically want to control the means of production. The vehicle for this was the capture of the environmental movement, which has been mentioned. Prior to 1970, the environmental movement, in America at least, was concerned with, species survival, landscape preservation, clean air, clean water, and so on. Things that one normally would think of as in terms of environment. But a change occurred with the first Earth Day in 1970. And there the focus turned to the energy sector. Of course, it's fundamental to all production, so that's a good leverage point. And relatedly, it involves trillions of dollars, which saving the whales does not. And that will turn out to be a fundamental feature. The new focus was accompanied by the creation of new environmental groups. In addition to capturing the old ones, there were things like Environmental Defense, now Environmental Defense Fund, the Natural Resources Defense Council. It was also accompanied by new governmental organizations in the US. The Environmental Protection Agency was created by Nixon. You also had the Department of Transportation as a new thing. You also had the professional societies again. In my field, the American Meteorological Society, the American Geophysical Union, and even the honorific societies like the National Academy, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and so on. In the UK, the Royal Society was an easy takeover. When you began this issue of focusing on the energy, I would suggest there was a little bit of floundering around. People didn't quite know what to do. So you started with the fact that this metric, which is nonsense of global mean energy change, was cooling from 1930s to this time in the 70s. And so you had the global cooling concern. The idea there was sulfate aerosols from burning coal were reflecting light and cooling the atmosphere, cooling the earth. And the cooling would end in the 70s. They tried to use the same thing to argue that acid rain was being caused by this, and you had the forest die off, and that also failed. When turned in the 70s to CO2. And CO2 was, element of the greenhouse effect, but controlling it was an obvious temptation for any control freak. I mean, after all, any burning of a fossil fuel, when you do it as cleanly as possible, will be left with CO2. Your breathing produces CO2. Your mouth has 40,000 parts per million instead of 400. So you'd like to control that if you're a politician. I mean, that's controlling everything. The trouble was that doubling carbon dioxide would only give you about a degree because, water vapor and clouds were more important. And then came the rescue. Somebody discovered that if you used a one-dimensional model that was unrealistic and made an unrealistic assumption that relative humidity remained constant, water vapor would increase as CO2 warmed, doubling the effect of CO2 alone. So that would bring you to maybe 2 degrees. And soon it became what I call the stock and trade of all models, to find positive feedbacks that would amplify the effect of CO2. And you got it to 3 degrees and sometimes 4, although they're generally reckoned as unrealistic. This violated something called the Chatelier's principle, which always said that natural systems that are long-lasting would tend to oppose change. But that was never rigorously proven, so positive feedback became the staple of the models. And there was enthusiasm that was boundless. I mean, this is where you had the virtue signaling elites saying we had to get rid of CO2 emissions, or, zero emissions by maybe a decade or 2 or 3, with no idea of how to achieve this without destroying society. And of course, with offshore wind killing the mammals that you used to want to save. But ordinary people, in America at least, responded with good common sense. Most of them felt 3 degrees doesn't sound like much either. This is something you negotiate every day without thinking about. Why is it such a big deal? The odd thing about what I call the educated elites, us, is most of us are not going to be great creative figures, but will have been good students. And what does that mean? It means that we've learned to please our professors. And that has enabled us to develop a skill which is dangerous. We are able to rationalize anything, no matter how stupid. This, I think, explains why in the US, maybe as opposed to Europe, Ordinary people, farmers, workers, and so on, tend generally to be skeptical of this issue and knowledgeable compared to the educated elite who support it blindly. I should mention that it is the business that it's political, and once the ordinary people are no longer impressed by a degree or a half degree, the politicians became hysterical. You then saw a major switch, which all of you know. It no longer was that a half degree was so important, it was that extreme events are due to climate change. Now, this is interesting because the first 5 UN reports all said they could find no relation between extreme events and climate. But the powers that be didn't care. What they knew is every day, someplace on Earth, there's an extreme event. And you can have a video of that and show it on television, and visuals have a much more important impact emotionally than a half degree. And that change contradicted the science, made perfectly clear it's political. Okay, let me just say something about the consensus, because it was always propagandistic, but it had its own interesting effects. I've often pointed out, in 1988, when this was rolled out in the US, Newsweek had a cover of the Earth on fire and the statement, "All scientists agree." This was at a time when there were about 5 institutions in America that were even looking at this. The main one was in the Soviet Union, and then called Leningrad. This didn't seem to matter, and this was again the issue I mentioned at the beginning, saying all scientists agreed gets people who don't know science comfortable with the issue, and it gives them something to be active about. You had Al Gore and Clinton Gore come in, they increased the funding by a factor of 15. And that created a community now that was interested in climate, but they knew that they could only get one answer. And that made it even easier. You had something going on, politicians would indicate what was the argument, somebody would make an argument against climate. And let's say they said it wasn't unprecedented, you had a medieval warm period. Word got out, who can get rid of the medieval warm period? And there would always be someone who would say, I can, and he would fudge the data and get off and be rewarded. Another was just asking, how can you attribute the little bit of temperature change we've seen to CO2? And in general, the IPCC for years was saying, we won't be able to do this for decades. And then somebody comes up and says, I could do it, and they do it in an absurd way. If you look at the IPCC, and I started with a statement, do your homework, what you find they're saying is that it will have an impact. Whereas their economists expect the GDP to go up 200% by 2100, now they say it'll only go up 197. This does not sound like an existential threat to me. It should not be something that a teenage girl doesn't want to get married or have children because her life will end in 12 years. And yet that's what we're having. So here we are, we're confronted with policies that destroy Western economies, impoverish the working middle class, condemn billions of the world's poorest to continued poverty and increased starvation, leave our children despairing over the alleged absence of a future, and will enrich the enemies of the West who are enjoying the spectacle of our suicide march, a march that the energy sector cowardly accepts, being too lazy to exert the modest effort needed to check what is being claimed. Voltaire, long ago, summed it up. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Thank you.
Thank you.